Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about Roman numerals because from an alt history point of view, I think there might be some inconsistencies that we can look at and maybe ask a few questions. So let's get started. Now, the Roman numeral system itself was descended from ancient Etruscan numerals, which itself was adapted from the Greek Attic symbols. So you have a progression of this numeral system from Greek to Etruscan to Roman, and you might even be able to throw in Phoenician before the Greek. So, okay, fair enough. Now, one of the first things of interest to me anyway is that the Roman numerals are actually very limited with regards to mathematics. The Roman system was fine for recording amounts of things, but not so useful for manipulating those amounts. And of course, the Romans had access to the abacus, so they could do what they needed to do with regards to figures, but there's still a limit as far as more complex mathematics that you can do with the Roman numeral system. And it's just interesting to me because there is this lineage from the Greek to the Etruscan to the Roman, and there's just a wealth of Greek mathematicians. Some of the greatest mathematicians of all time come from this Greek heritage, like Pythagoras, Aristotle, Archimedes, just to name a few. So that's just one thing to me that sticks out. So basically there were no noteworthy native Roman mathematicians to speak of. And curiously, the Romans, they took little interest in Greek trigonometry, which actually could have been of great value in surveying, engineering, and astronomy. So there actually was a value in applying some of these mathematics, which would have entailed a slightly different number system, but they chose these Roman numerals, so with its limitations. So I find that very interesting. Now, the second thing I want to touch on are the Etruscans, because I didn't really know much about the Etruscans prior to looking into any of this, but the Etruscans, who were told eventually absorbed into the Roman Republic in 27 BC, their civilization spanned hundreds of years, but when you start looking into their alphabet, their language, their number systems, you find that a lot of this information was actually lost. Even though this civilization was absorbed by the Roman Empire, there's a lot of information that gets lost, and that starts with the Etruscan language itself. So this language actually was largely a dead language up until like the 1800s, when I believe it was a Croatian man was visiting in the 1840s, I believe, visiting Egypt, and this person bought a mummy wrapped in these linen wrappings. But I guess the linen wrappings had all these symbols on them, and he didn't think much of it. So this mummy was sitting in, I believe, this person's library until he died, and then eventually the mummy made its way to a museum where it sat for a few decades as well, until finally somebody started really paying attention to these linen wrappings and realizing it was actually Etruscan. So this article was just talking about how a puzzle confounded Egyptologists when an unidentified ancient language was found on a mummy's bandages in the 1800s. So they've been trying to decipher this language ever since, and they've come a long way, but there's still so much that's unknown about the Etruscan language itself. And when you start looking at the history of the Etruscan language, we're told Emperor Claudius was probably one of the last, if not the last person to actually speak Etruscan. And fortunately, he actually was the author of approximately 20 books on the history of the Etruscan people, because apparently they didn't have any of their own histories, but now sadly even those books are lost. So it's just so wild to me that this civilization that was around 500 plus years and was absorbed by the Roman Republic, and it had influence on their language potentially, but especially their number system. There's no writings of that. It says here, none of their own histories or literature survives. So it's almost like there was an eradication of everything Etruscan. So to me, that is very interesting from a hidden history perspective, and there's probably a lot more to this, but I just wanted to bring it up because I thought it was very interesting. And if you take a look at the alphabet, the Etruscan alphabet, they read it from right to left, but when you actually take that alphabet and you reverse it, it starts to look a lot like the typical alphabet that we have today for a lot of countries. A, B, C, D, E, F, I, and then a lot of interesting symbols, but some recognizable symbols in here, P, T, X, Y. So even though they had all this influence on our present day and the Roman Empire, they were just seemingly expunged from our ancient history. So really, really interesting to me. And as mentioned, they had an influence on the Roman numerals as well. So this is just Etruscan for 1. The symbol for 5 is very similar, 10, 100 potentially. So I just wanted to add this because I found it very interesting. Because I think that there was actually an apocalyptic event that destroyed the Roman Empire, or whatever it truly was. But Rome itself was being dug out even in the early 1900s, and there are traces of the Roman Empire buried throughout Europe. This is Sofia, Bulgaria, and of course the United Kingdom is just full of buried Roman sites. This was a Roman bathhouse, which is underneath Exeter Cathedral, and this is a more current Roman mosaic uncovered. I think this is from 2022, but I think this is a result of some destructive event, and our history has been rewritten at a later point. Could that have been the 1300s? Potentially. And I think a lot of empires came to an end sometime during this apocalyptic event, potentially civilizations like the Maya, and even in India there were civilizations that came to an end in the first millennia, and again largely buried as well for the Maya and for this empire as well. So that's just my speculation. But another aspect I want to touch on is, how did they phase out these Roman numerals? How medieval Europe finally ditched Roman numerals. Well, it turns out that they eventually, when I say they, I mean Europe, finally adopted the Arabic numeral system. So, 1 through 9 plus 0. But when you start looking at the history of this Arabic numeral system, we're told it originated in India actually, and then made its way to Persia. So it made its way to the Middle East, and then eventually back into Spain and Italy, and then through the rest of Europe by the 13th century basically. So we're told that this new number system, it comes from outside influences into Europe. And I always found that very interesting, because I think there were traces of Arabic in Europe actually beforehand. Like maybe these things originated in Europe as opposed to all these things coming into Europe. Because when you start looking into Arabic coins, especially from the first millennium, you notice that there were actually a lot of Arabic coins in Europe. Primarily, I think it was in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. And this has been brought up by people like Anatoly Fomenko, David Ewing Jr., and I don't agree with everything they're saying, but as far as the presence of these coins, they do exist in Europe. And there were studies done just talking about how most of these coins, which were discovered in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, of all of those coins, nearly 500,000, more than 80% have been found in Europe. So I think potentially I would agree that their origin actually was Europe, and it's the other way around. And a lot of Viking sites have these mixture of Roman coins and these Arabic coins. And I think the speculation is that the Vikings, which we're typically told occupied the time frame 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, they actually would have coexisted with the Roman Empire from the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and they've just been artificially separated by 500 or so years by Scaliger and the like. So I think there was an Arabic influence in Europe. So I find it really interesting that this Arabic numeral system, we're being told, comes from India to Persia, the Middle East, and then back into Europe. And maybe it was the other way around. Maybe. But I just wanted to mention that. Now, just 2 more points. And one is, when you actually look at division and how fractions were used with Roman numerals, you can find that there were actually Roman numerals focusing on dividing, but they all seem to be focused on twelfths. It's almost like base 12 for some reason, but when you count up, it almost seems to be base 10, 100, 500,000, 5,000, and so on. So that is an interesting aspect to this. So I just wanted to mention that. And the last thing I want to touch on is when you start digging into Roman numerals, one of the things that stands out is that apparently a lot of older clocks actually use the Roman numeral 4 instead of IV, which represents 4 as well in Roman numerals. So Roman numerals obviously have continued in Europe, but more so from an ornamental perspective and on things such as clock faces. But what's being mentioned here is that why didn't they use the number IV for 4 instead of actual 4 represented this way? And there is a lot of theories about it, why the 4 individual eyes are used instead of the IV, but it seems that no one today really knows the true answer, and this is from 2022. So it's just an interesting thing that's out there on some of these older clocks. They chose to depict 4 like this, even though the Roman Empire, we're told they depicted it as IV. So just wanted to bring this up. And in Ottawa even, the Peace Tower, which we're told was built in 1920, I believe, or completed in 1920, they used the 4 eyes instead of the IV as well. Even some old coins, Louis XIV, he lived in primarily the 1600s, early 1700s, but you can find some Louis XIV coins depicted with the 4 eyes instead of the IV. So just something of note. I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. But this is just sort of an introductory look into Roman numerals and some of the threads that we're pulling on, which might lead to further research. So that's all I think I have for you for today. I want to once again give a big shout out to all my patrons. I really appreciate all your help and support, and I thank you very much. So with that being said, until next time, take care. Bye.